Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. I'm back today with another tutorial, another duck, and this time I'm actually going to be using a photo reference that I took myself. This weekend I took my camera out to the park while I was doing my WALK with my dogs, who, by the way, they are being extremely rowdy right now, so if we get some background noise, I hope that you will forgive me for that. I'm trying to do this voiceover really quick before I head out to work. So the subject today right here is in the upper left-hand corner. I'll just keep this up here since it fits pretty nicely in the frame here. And I'm just sketching it onto my watercolor paper, being very general. Of course, the template will be available to you. The links are below. And if you check out the Gumroad link, this template will be free for at least the first 24 hours that this video is posted. The last two templates I had, I completely forgot to change, so they were actually free for several days. Hopefully lots of you were able to go grab those up and enjoy those. So I'm keeping my sketch here pretty general. The template might have a few more details in it just for your own information, but you really don't need to transfer a lot of the lines over to your watercolor paper to follow along with this tutorial. This one's actually relatively simple. We'll be spending most of the time in the negative space, so in the water around the duck, just trying to build up the values. And we're going to leave some parts of this duck completely white. And we're not really going to focus on texture in the feathers really at all. I'm obviously not a great photographer, and so my photo reference is very blown out and crazy, but it actually works for watercolor painting quite well in my opinion. So you really don't have to be a good photographer to take reference photos for paintings. In fact, one thing that I really struggle with a lot when I'm using the professional reference photos that I get on pixabay.com is that they actually have like too much information and detail in them, and it's so easy to get distracted by all of that. So actually for painting, I would say that amateur photographs can actually be a lot better. Alright, so let's get into this tutorial. You can see I'm already working on it here. I'm starting out with a very light wash of phthalo blue all around the duck, and then I'm going to be merging this into some of the shadows of the duck as well. One thing that I really like about painting anything that is white, like this white duck or a white chicken or, you know, whatever, is that when you have a white subject, a lot of the other colors from the environment around it are going to bounce off of the white object and create a really interesting chroma throughout that subject, especially kind of in the midtones and shadow areas. So you can see I'm just dragging the phthalo blue into the shadows of the duck, and I'm letting all of this kind of merge together. Anywhere that isn't really light in value or white, I'm covering that with this phthalo blue. This painting will have a lot of lost edges in it, which is really one of my favorite things to explore, whether I'm doing watercolor painting or oil painting or whatever. Just finding ways to incorporate lost edges, I think, makes a painting so interesting. So basically anywhere that the value is similar from one area to another. So for example, in the shadow that's reflecting into the water, so it's kind of like a shadow reflection, a lot of that just kind of merges together into one value. So when you're doing this, you really don't have to be overly careful. The only areas that I'm really being careful is just kind of the smaller shadow areas on the head of the duck and on the body of the duck. And also you don't need to worry about having your wash in the background be overly even, because of course this is water, it's very organic. I'm not going to try to paint in like all the subtle reflections around the duck. I'm not even going to be extremely careful on the actual reflection of the duck. When you're painting water, it's best to keep it very loose and somewhat messy, because those shapes are organic, and if you watch them, of course, they're just ever changing. So there's no right or wrong way to paint water, and it can be one of the most fun things to paint as long as you just kind of let yourself relax into it. So at this point I kind of need this to settle and dry a little bit because I'm going to do some glazing on top of it. So I actually paused my video there and now I'm back. Things are maybe still just a little bit damp, but I decided I can probably go ahead and start working on some other things while I wait for that background to dry just a little bit more. So I'm using just a little bit of this lemon yellow on the beak. I just had some left over from the last painting that I did. I didn't really replenish that, and I really don't need too much. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of yellow ochre in there just to add a bit of warmth to it, because that lemon yellow right against that phthalo blue, it almost begins to optically blend and create a sense of green that isn't really there and isn't really meant to be there. So I'm going to keep the lemon yellow really minimal and kind of just go over that with some yellow ochre to warm that up. And now I'm going to go into my Paynes gray and begin to build up the value. So the phthalo blue is really just there to serve as kind of an undertone. I want it to kind of peek through in very subtle ways, but for the most part, this painting is really probably 90% Paynes gray. And if you watch my videos, you know that Paynes gray has been my kind of favorite pigment or favorite color to use for quite a while. I don't want to go in too dark right at first, and I also want to not have it be too wet because I want to allow for opportunities for this phthalo blue to peek through, especially in the area on the body of the duck that is in shadow a little bit. I don't want this to be too even of a wash. So even in the water, I'm going to let my brush kind of skip around a little bit so that some of that phthalo blue can just kind of peek through and create a little bit of a warm contrast. I think of phthalo blue as a warm blue. I know some people say that that's a cool blue. Whatever, we won't get into that. I've been thinking about that way too much lately, and you know, why different people see those temperatures in blues differently. But I'm sticking to my story. So I want some of that warm phthalo blue just to be kind of peeking through. I think it adds just a little bit of life. And of course, it's now spring, and it was a really nice day when I took this photograph, and so I do want to capture the fact that the sky was blue. It was a very pleasant and warm day. And I think that Paynes gray just makes things feel cooler. I think that that's why, to me, Paynes gray, ultramarine blue, those are cool blues, and then I associate the phthalo blue and kind of the blues that lean a little bit more toward green. I think of those as warm because that's what I see on like a warm, nice day, or if you think about the ocean in a tropical area, that's what color it is. So, you know, that's part of the reason I think of those blues as warm. So you can see I just kind of lightly washed over all of that phthalo blue. I let some of the areas that are on the shadow of the duck and in the reflection of the duck, I let those for now remain just that light wash of phthalo blue. They look kind of nice right now, actually. And now I'm going to carefully begin to bring some of the Paynes gray into the shadow of the duck. Again, being careful not to completely obliterate those nice, warm phthalo blues. So I'm not applying the Paynes gray just all over the place. And since I just squeezed out this Paynes gray, it's very malleable right now, and so every time I dip my brush into my well, I end up picking up way too much pigment. So what I typically have to do is dip my brush into my water, kind of wipe it off on my paper towel over there on the side so that I don't have too much pigment on my brush at this point. And now I'm starting to just kind of work out some of the darker areas in the reflection. For a reflection, it's really important not to think of that as being like, okay, I'm painting this way on the actual subject, so I have to paint the exact same thing into the reflection. If you're going off of a photo reference, then follow the photo reference, because the angle at which we're viewing the reflection in the water is just a little bit different than the angle we're seeing the duck. The duck is a little bit foreshortened because we're viewing the duck from above, but then the reflection in the water is actually a little bit more elongated, and you can really see it if you look at the shape of the neck in the reflection and contrast that with the shape of the neck in the actual duck. So I think that that's something that's really interesting and important to pay attention to and learn from. Because a lot of times I think people get frustrated with reflections because they think that it has to be like an exact match. Sometimes that's the case. It depends on the angle at which you're viewing the subject. But still, it's a reflection and it's in water, and so it's going to be very loose and organic anyway. And so there's no need to, first of all, try to match those two things exactly. And you should also really just kind of pay attention to reality and what is happening there and the different ways that you're seeing the subject in the reflection. But what I am trying to do is just to incorporate some of the darker shadow areas that I see in the reflection. And even in the areas in the reflection that are more highlights, they're still going to be darker than the highlights on the actual duck, if that makes sense. So right now, if you look at the tail feathers on the duck and then the reflection in the water, you can see that the reflection in the water is still white where those tail feathers are. That's another area, by the way, that you can really see the difference between the subject, the duck, and then the shape of the tail feathers and the reflection are a little bit different, which I just find that really interesting. But anyway, I will eventually go over the reflection, those white tail feathers in the reflection, to make those just a little bit darker than the actual subject, the actual duck, because we don't want those two highlight areas to be competing with one another like they are right now. But again, I'm just kind of bringing the value down a little bit. I am approaching this in a way where my values are going to be a little bit darker in the water around the tail of the bird, and then I leave it a little bit lighter as we move forward, really just for the sake of allowing those phthalo blues to show through a little bit more there, and not really for any other reason. Up until now, we've mostly been using our blues, our phthalo blue to begin with, and then a lot of Paynes gray. But there are some warmer tones in this painting, especially within the feathers on the duck that are kind of in the midground, which I realize there isn't a lot of midground in my photo reference. There's kind of just shadow and then highlights. So I'm really kind of pushing the midtones a little bit in my painting just to make it a little bit more interesting and dimensional. And so I am going to add some warmer tones into a few areas there once I get all of my shadows in place. And I'm going to start building those warmer tones gradually, much the way that I try to build my shadows when I'm creating a sense of form. So what I'll do is I'll stick with this Paynes gray mix and just add a little bit of my red. That's Pyrrol red, by the way. Oh, and I just remembered, I didn't even go over my colors that I'm actually using for this painting. So let me do that really quick. I just add a little bit of this red into my Paynes gray, keeping that really light and diluted with water. So I used a little bit of lemon yellow. I think that's totally optional. Then I used my yellow ochre, Pyrrol red, and Paynes gray, and then remember just a little bit of that phthalo blue right at the beginning. So that's the colors that I'm using for this painting. And right now I'm just adding some of this Paynes gray with red in it, kind of that muted violet that I really like to use. And I probably use it too much in shadows especially, but it's such a nice, subtle, and beautiful color. I just can't get enough of it. So I'm adding that to some of the midtones. Basically, the areas that I'm going to leave completely white are just at the very top edge of the tail feathers and the back of the duck, and just a little bit on the head as well. Otherwise, I want to tone down a lot of these whites and give them a little bit of warmth. And now I'm glazing a little bit of shadow onto the beak of the duck. I ran out of red, so I need to get a little bit more of that. So again, this is Pyrrol red. It's extremely powerful. It's almost like using a cadmium red And if you know anything about cadmiums, they are super, super powerful. I love that lots of paint manufacturers have found formulas for paints like Pyrrol Red that mimic a lot of the properties of cadmiums and other pigments that are kind of toxic. And it's a good replacement for a cadmium. And that goes for oil painting as well. And again, the brand of these paints, these are mostly M grams. Everything except for the lemon yellow and phthalo blue is M gram. And what I love about this brand of watercolors is that they stay really malleable. So even if I don't paint for a day or two, when I come back, they're really easy to reactivate. Now I'm mixing up a very light wash of a warm yellow, or, basically an orange. So a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red, keeping it nice and watery and diluted so that I can glaze over the beak, especially in the reflection. Because again, the reflection, another area where it's a little bit different from the subject, is since we're viewing the bird from above, there's a little bit of a highlight on the beak where we get that nice pure lemon yellow, but we don't have that in the angle that we're seeing the reflection at. So we want to basically glaze over that reflected beak with a lot of this warmer tone that's a little bit darker in value. And then I'm adding just a little bit more yellow. I don't really have much lemon yellow left on my palette, but I'm just kind of making do. I don't need a lot anyway, because when I add a little bit of warmth onto the duck, I want that to remain very, very light. So basically what I want to do is add a bit of warm tone to those areas without impacting the value very much. So I still want the value to be extremely light, and you can barely see this mix of yellow and red that I'm using here. Again, the only areas that I'm really leaving totally white are just the very top of the tail feather, a little bit of the back, and then the top of the head. Everything else I want to apply this warm tone to. And another nice thing about being a terrible photographer and having a blown out photo is that, I'm really allowing the watercolor to do a lot of the work instead of me going in and trying to figure out all of the feathers. That's just something that I naturally want to do. And it's not that that's a bad thing, but sometimes you want to just let your watercolors be watercolors. So I'm adding some of this warmth even into the reflection. Again, still just keeping it very light and watery. A little bit of red and not phthalo, that is my Paynes gray, but I want to leave this leaning a little more toward red, and I'm going to glaze over the beak again just to add a little bit more value and form to that area. And we're just about done with this. There's just a few things we need to do, like we need to just add the eye. Once we have the eye in place, this is going to really read as basically being done, although as always I will fiddle with it a little bit. It's just what I do. When I sit down to paint, it is like so comfortable and I get so immersed in it that I think I just don't want it to end. And I think that that's probably the case for a lot of people who love to paint. That's why it's so hard to decide that a painting is done, because just when you're really starting to get into it and you're totally immersed and you're kind of lost in the process, that's when you're supposed to stop, apparently, which is so difficult, I know. But I think I did a good job this time practicing a little bit of restraint and allowing the watercolor medium to kind of speak for itself, which is what I really enjoyed about this particular painting. So I'm adding a little bit of that Paynes gray Pyrrol red to the reflection to bring some of that value down, especially in the reflected beak, and then a little bit on the head. At this point, a lot of this is really dry, so you can see I'm getting a lot of hard edges. So I don't want to do too much of that. At this point, I've taken some of the pigment off the brush and added a little water, so I can kind of use that to help those hard edges merge out or fuzz out a little bit. One thing I would change about this painting is that I left too much contrast in the head of the duck in the reflection, if that makes sense. So if you look at the reflection of the head, there's too much contrast in there. And so just adding a little bit of Paynes gray to that area where it's really, really light, I think would actually help that to read a little bit better. It's kind of distracting the way it is. And so I actually might go back and fix that even after the fact. Just a light glaze of Paynes gray right over that highlight will probably do the trick. And then again, I added some more concentrated pigment of the Paynes gray to the water behind and underneath the duck. But again, I want to leave the water around the head of the duck a little bit lighter. And I want more of that phthalo blue to be just kind of subtly peeking through there, just to add a little bit of a color shift between the left side of the water and then the right side, because the background's pretty plain, it's pretty simple, and so just to add a very subtle little bit of visual interest, I like that kind of color shift and subtle value shift right there. Alright, so this tutorial is complete. I hope that you like this. Hey guys, if you like my videos, I hope that you'll share them and help my channel to grow. I really appreciate you guys watching. It makes me so happy when you download the templates. And this one, of course, is available to you for free for a limited time. So go ahead and grab that and give me some feedback. Let me know if you guys are enjoying the birds. Let me know if there's other things that you think that you might like to see in the near future. I would really love to hear from you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I hope that you'll do that as well. All right, so I'm heading off to work. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.